The golden sunset painted the Missouri sky as the stagecoach rattled into Willow Creek, its wheels kicking up dust that swirled like ghosts through the fading light. Eleanor Blackwood clutched her wooden crutch with white knuckles, her other hand holding tight to the leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. The journey had taken all she had, her savings, her courage, and the last shreds of the security she once knew, all for the promise of a new beginning in the arms of a man whose letters had painted dreams of acceptance and partnership. As the stagecoach lurched to a stop, Eleanor took a deep breath and peered through the window at the small frontier town that would be her new home. Or so she had hoped. Sometimes promises are made only to be broken, and hope can shatter faster than glass against stone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory sprawled endlessly before Eleanor as the stagecoach had made its final approach to Willow Creek. For 3 days, the coach had bumped and swayed over rutted trails, each mile taking her further from the familiar streets of Philadelphia and closer to an uncertain future. The other passengers, a middle-aged merchant and his wife, a young schoolteacher headed for a position in Helena, and a traveling salesman, had long since stopped staring at Eleanor's twisted leg and the crutch that leaned against the seat. Beside her, Willow Creek coming up, the driver's voice called down. Last stop before Blackwater Pass. Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her modest grey travelling dress, adjusting it carefully to better conceal the steel brace encasing her right leg. 6 days of travel had left dark circles beneath her green eyes, and wisps of auburn hair had escaped the neat bun at the nape of her neck. She wasn't beautiful, she had never harboured such illusions, but she had once been told she had a pleasing face with high cheekbones and a determined chin that hinted at the strength within. "Are you meeting someone, dear?" the merchant's wife asked, straightening her expensive bonnet as the coach slowed. "Yes, ma'am. My fiancé." The word still felt foreign on Eleanor's tongue. "Mr. Jackson Bailey." Fiancé. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "A man you've never met." "We've exchanged letters for 8 months, Eleanor explained, removing an envelope from her pocket. The paper was creased from countless readings, the neat handwriting now as familiar to her as her own reflection. "He owns a cattle ranch outside town." The woman's expression softened with pity. "You're a brave soul." Brave wasn't the word Eleanor would have chosen. Desperate, perhaps. After her father's death had left the family destitute, after her position as a seamstress at Whitmore's dress shop had been terminated because customers found her disability unsettling, after her younger sister Mary had married and moved west. With her new husband, what choice did she have? The matrimonial advertisement in the Western Matrimonial News had seemed like divine providence. Rancher seeks bride. 30 years of age, established homestead in Dakota Territory, seeking companion. Of good character and practical education. Must be willing to assist with household management and embrace frontier life. Photograph appreciated, but not required. Eleanor hadn't sent a photograph. She couldn't bear to imagine Jackson Bailey's reaction to seeing her standing with her crutch, her right leg visibly twisted beneath her skirts. Instead, she had sent a letter describing herself honestly, her education at the ladies' seminary in Philadelphia, her skills with needle and thread, her fondness for poetry and music, her inexperience with ranch life but willingness to learn. What she hadn't mentioned was the childhood accident that had crushed her right leg, leaving her with a twisted limb that required both a brace and a crutch to walk. She had mentioned losing her father to pneumonia that winter, leaving her to fend for herself. What she hadn't detailed was that her last $40 had gone to purchase the stagecoach ticket, that the grey dress she wore was her only good garment, painstakingly altered and pressed for this occasion, that the job rejections had become a weekly humiliation. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. "Good luck to you, dear," the merchant's wife said, her eyes betraying her doubts about Eleanor's prospects. "Thank you, Ma'am." Eleanor nodded politely, steeling herself for what was to come. The most difficult part of her journey was about to begin, not just meeting Jackson, but revealing what she had concealed in her letters. The driver helped her down from the coach, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her crutch and uneven gait. But he said nothing. Eleanor stood on the wooden platform, the October wind cutting through her thin coat as she took in her first glimpse of Willow Creek, Dakota Territory. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, some still bearing the raw look of frontier construction. A general store, a saloon, a small white church with a simple steeple, a livery stable. Men in dusty clothes moved about their business, eyeing the newly arrived stagecoach with mild interest. Eleanor stood beside her small trunk, the Dakota sun beating down on her uncovered head, and searched the faces for Jackson Bailey. His letters had described him as tall with dark hair and a full beard, but that description could fit half the men in town. "You look lost, miss." A young boy of perhaps 12 approached, munching on an apple. "Stage don't come through often. You meeting someone?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. "Mr. Jackson Bailey. Do you know him?" The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Bailey, sure do. His ranch is about 3 miles outside town. You want me to fetch him for you? He comes on Thursdays for supplies." "Today is Thursday," Eleanor said, her pulse quickening. "Is he here?" The boy nodded. "Saw him at Peterson's store about an hour ago." He squinted down the street. "That's him there, coming out of the saloon." Eleanor followed his gaze and her breath caught. A man was emerging from a building down the street, tall and broad-shouldered, in a dark duster coat. Even from this distance, she could see he matched the description from the letters. Dark hair and beard, both neatly trimmed, and a purposeful way of moving that suggested confidence. "Thank you," she whispered to the boy, who shrugged and scampered off. Eleanor smoothed her dress with trembling hands and picked up her satchel, leaving her trunk on the platform for now. This was the moment she had travelled over 2,000 miles for the beginning of her new life. She took a deep breath and began walking toward him, her crutch tapping against the wooden sidewalk, her gait uneven, but determined. Jackson Bailey was examining a package when he sensed someone approaching. He looked up, his expression initially neutral, then questioning as he saw Eleanor walking directly toward him. "Mr. Bailey." Her voice was steady despite the riot of nerves in her stomach. "Yes?" He studied her face, no recognition in his eyes. "I am Eleanor Blackwood from Philadelphia." She waited for the dawn of understanding. It came slowly, his brow furrowing before his eyes widened. "Miss Blackwood? You're here?" "Yes." She smiled tentatively. "I received your letter confirming our arrangement. I came as soon as I could." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, certainly, but also something else Eleanor couldn't quite name. Discomfort, perhaps. Then his gaze dropped to her crutch, to the way she stood favoring her left leg, and his expression changed completely. "Miss Blackwood, He cleared his throat, glancing around as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. Your last letter said any time after October would be suitable," she reminded him gently. "It's now the middle of October." "Yes, of course." He nodded, still seeming disoriented by her presence. His eyes travelled over her, taking in her simple dress, her worn satchel, lingering on her crutch, and the brace partially visible beneath her skirt. His expression hardened slightly. "You didn't mention your condition in your letters." Heat crept into Eleanor's cheeks. "No, I didn't. I should have been more forthcoming." Jackson's jaw tightened. His gaze returned to her face, assessing now rather than welcoming. "Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He led her across the street to a small cafe attached to the town's only hotel. Inside, the dimly lit space was mostly empty, with only an elderly couple seated near the window. Jackson selected a table in the far corner and pulled out a chair for Eleanor with stiff courtesy. Once seated, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap to keep them from fidgeting, acutely aware of every creak of the wooden floor, every clink of dishes from behind the counter. "Coffee?" Jackson finally asked. "Yes, please." Her mouth was dry with apprehension. He signaled to a waitress, ordered 2 coffees, then turned back to Eleanor. His handsome face was guarded now, so different from the warmth she had imagined behind his written words. "Miss Blackwood," he began after the coffee arrived, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Eleanor's heart sank. What kind of misunderstanding? "Mr. Bailey," Jackson stirred his coffee slowly, not meeting her eyes. "In your letters, you described yourself as a seamstress, an educated woman. You didn't mention that you were—" He paused, searching for words. "Crippled," Eleanor finished for him, her voice quiet but direct. His eyes snapped to hers, surprised by her frankness. "I've worked hard to establish my ranch, Miss Blackwood. It's beginning to prosper, but I need a wife who can—" He trailed off. "Who can what, Mr. Bailey? Walk without assistance, run after children, work the fields alongside." "You?" There was no bitterness in her tone, only a clear-eyed assessment of what he was trying to say. "A ranch wife's life is difficult," he said, his voice hardening. "There are physical demands, cooking for ranch hands, maintaining a household, potentially, helping with livestock in emergencies. I need someone robust, someone who won't be limited." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. She had known coming west was a risk, but she hadn't expected such a clinical assessment of her worth based solely on her physical capabilities. "I have other strengths, Mr. Bailey. I'm well educated. I can keep books for your ranch, manage household affairs, sew clothing that would cost a fortune to order from back east. Strengths I can hire for less than the cost of supporting a wife," he cut in. "I'm sorry if this seems cruel, Miss Blackwood, but I must think practically. The winters here are brutal, the work never-ending. How would you manage when the snow is knee-deep, when a fire needs tending in the middle of the night?" Outside the window, a group of men passed by, laughing loudly. 2 of them glanced inside, their eyes landing on Eleanor and Jackson, their curiosity evident. One nudged the other and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Word traveled fast in small towns, Eleanor realized. Already they knew who she must be, the mail-order bride, come to marry Jackson Bailey. "I've already announced our engagement. At Sunday service," Jackson continued, lowering his voice. "Folks have been congratulating me all week. But, under the circumstances, you wish to rescind your proposal," Eleanor stated bluntly. "I think it would be best." He at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I can provide you with enough money for a return ticket to Philadelphia." Eleanor's fingernails dug into her palms beneath the table. "And what would I return to, Mr. Bailey? I gave up my room. I sold what little furniture I owned." A flicker of guilt crossed his face, quickly replaced by resolve. "That's not my concern, Miss Blackwood. I made no promises about accepting you regardless of your circumstances. No, you merely implied it with every letter." She could feel the stares of the other patrons now, the weight of their judgment and curiosity. "What will you tell them?" She nodded toward the window where more townsfolk were passing by, some slowing to peek inside. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "The truth, that there was a misunderstanding." "The truth," Eleanor repeated, her voice barely audible. "That I'm too crippled to be worthy of becoming Mrs. Bailey." His jaw clenched. "I have a reputation in this town, Miss Blackwood, a standing. I can't appear foolish." "No," she agreed, a strange calm settling over her despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Better that I appear foolish instead. The desperate woman who came west with nothing but a satchel and misplaced hope." Jackson opened his mouth to reply, but the cafe door swung open, and a boisterous group of men entered, ranch hands, by the look of them, dust-covered and loud after a day's work. One of them spotted Jackson and raised a hand in greeting. "Bailey, there you are." The man approached their table, his smile fading as he sensed the tension. His eyes moved to Eleanor, curious. "This, the Philadelphia bride we've been hearing about?" Eleanor stiffened at the description. Jackson stood abruptly. "Not now, Harris." But Harris was already extending a hand to Eleanor. "Welcome to Willow Creek, ma'am. You sure traveled a long way. When's the wedding?" The cafe had gone quiet, all eyes on their table. Eleanor saw the panic in Jackson's face, the desperation to avoid public embarrassment. "There won't be a wedding?" Jackson said tightly. "There's been a misunderstanding." Harris looked between them, confusion clear on his weathered face. "Misunderstanding? What kind?" "The kind where I expected a bride who could handle ranch life, not an invalid with a crutch," Jackson snapped, his composure finally breaking under the pressure of public scrutiny. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Eleanor sat frozen, the words echoing in her ears. She had endured much in her 26 years. The childhood accident that had left her disabled, the loss of her father, poverty, the countless small humiliations that came with being a crippled woman in a world that valued physical perfection. But never had she felt so utterly exposed, so completely stripped of dignity. With mechanical precision, she stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up her satchel. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Bailey," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I won't trouble you further." Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the cafe, past the staring faces, into the harsh sunlight of a Dakota afternoon. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation erupting, Jackson's voice rising defensively. Eleanor didn't look back. She walked down the main street, her mind racing. She had exactly $12.36 in her pocket, not enough for a room for more. Then a few nights, certainly not enough for a ticket back east. The sun beat down mercilessly, as if to emphasize the bleakness of her situation. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country, she stopped. Miles of prairie stretched before her, dotted with distant cattle and the occasional homestead. This was the West she had dreamed of, the open possibility of it, now just another cruel reminder of all she couldn't have. A wagon rattled past, the driver tipping his hat politely before continuing on. Eleanor watched it disappear down the dusty road, then turned and began walking again, this time away from town. She had no destination in mind, only the blind need to escape the whispers and stares, to find somewhere quiet to gather her thoughts and form a new plan. The dirt road stretched ahead of her, winding through stands of cottonwood trees already bare for winter. Her leg ached from the long stagecoach journey and the emotional confrontation, but she pressed on, one uneven step after another, her crutch sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. "I won't cry," she told herself firmly. "Not for him, not for any of it." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Eleanor looked up to see storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, moving steadily closer. Perfect, she thought with grim humor. A fitting end to a disastrous day. She should find shelter, she knew. But where? Return to Willow Creek and face the humiliation again? Sleep beneath a tree and hope the storm passes quickly? As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splashing into the dirt and dotting her grey dress with darker patches, Eleanor realized that for the first time in her life, she had no plan, no next step to take. She had gambled everything on Jackson, Bailey's promise of a future, and she had lost. The rain came harder now, soaking through Eleanor's thin dress. She clutched her satchel against her chest, trying to protect the few possessions inside from the downpour. Each step became more difficult, as the dirt road turned to mud, making her crutch sink deeper with every labored movement. The Dakota landscape, which had seemed so full of promise from the stagecoach window just hours ago, now felt vast and threatening. The distant hills had disappeared behind a curtain of rain, and the rolling plains offered no shelter from the intensifying storm. Lightning cracked overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. Eleanor quickened her pace as much as her leg would allow, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. Through the curtain of rain, she noticed what appeared to be a barn or outbuilding on a distant hillside. With no better option available, she began moving toward it, each step a battle against the increasingly muddy ground. The storm intensified, wind driving the rain sideways. Eleanor's dress clung to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face. Her satchel grew heavier, waterlogged and awkward to carry. The steel brace on her leg chafed against her skin, the leather straps swelling with moisture. As she drew closer, she could see that the structure was indeed a barn, old but solid-looking, attached to a modest farmhouse set back among a stand of pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the autumn season. Someone was home. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the property. She had no desire to face more rejection today, but the storm left her little choice. She would ask only for temporary shelter in the barn until the worst of the weather passed. Surely no one would be heartless enough to refuse such a basic kindness. With that thin hope clutched tight, she made her way to the barn door, each step taking her further from the life she had planned and closer to whatever waited ahead. Be it shelter from the storm, or yet another door closed in her face. The rain hammered against Eleanor's shoulders as she approached the weathered barn door. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the structure in harsh white light before plunging it back into the grey shroud of the storm. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the wooden latch. The door finally gave way with a groan of protest, and she stumbled inside. The sudden absence of rain was disorienting. Eleanor stood dripping on the packed dirt floor, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness. The air smelled of hay, leather and animals, earthy and strangely comforting after her ordeal. "Hello?" she called softly, not wanting to startle anyone who might be inside. Only the shifting of horses in their stalls and the drumming of rain on the roof answered her. Eleanor moved deeper into the barn, her sodden boots leaving dark impressions. On the ground, the structure was larger than it had appeared from outside, with 4 stalls on each side and a loft above. 3 of the stalls contained horses, fine-looking animals that watched her with mild curiosity. This was no modest homestead, she realized. The quality of the barn alone spoke of prosperity, but unlike Jackson Bailey's carefully maintained ranch house, which she had glimpsed from the stagecoach on her arrival, this place had a lived-in quality. Tools hung in practical, accessible places rather than for show. Harnesses were well-oiled, but bore the marks of regular use. Eleanor sank onto a bale of hay, her leg finally giving out. The events of the day crashed over her in waves. The journey's end, Jackson's cold dismissal, the public humiliation, the long walk to nowhere, and now this desperate shelter-seeking. She had never felt so utterly alone. A sob rose in her throat, but she forced it back. Crying wouldn't improve her situation. She needed to think, to plan. But the gentle rhythm of the rain and the warm dimness of the barn conspired against her determination. Exhaustion tugged at her limbs and clouded her mind. "Just a moment's rest," she whispered to herself, laying her head against her satchel. "Then I'll figure out what to do next." Her eyes drifted closed as the storm continued its assault outside. "Ma'am? Ma'am? Can you hear me?" The voice penetrated. Eleanor's fog of sleep deep and concerned. She jerked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. A man stood over her, his features shadowed by the lantern he held aloft. I'm sorry, she stammered, scrambling to sit upright. I didn't mean to trespass. The storm— Easy now, the man said, setting the lantern on a nearby post. No one's accusing you of anything. As he moved into the light, Eleanor could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against a simple workshirt. His face was tanned from long days outdoors, with lines at the corners of eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. A short beard, neatly trimmed, covered a strong jaw. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with wheat-colored hair and eyes, the color of a summer sky. What caught her attention, however, was not his face, but his unusual gait as he approached. He moved with a distinctive unevenness, and then she understood why. Where his right leg should have been below the knee, there was instead a wooden prosthetic, visible beneath his rolled-up pant leg. Nathaniel Cooper, he introduced himself, not offering his hand, but instead keeping a respectful distance. This is my farm you've wandered onto. Eleanor Blackwood, she replied, smoothing her dress in a futile attempt at dignity. The fabric was still damp and hopelessly wrinkled. I truly am sorry for the intrusion, Mr. Cooper. I was caught in the storm with nowhere to go. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies, assessed her with frank curiosity. His gaze lingered briefly on her crutch, then returned to her face without a flicker of the pity or disgust she had grown accustomed to seeing. You're a long way from anywhere to be out walking in this weather, Miss Blackwood, he observed. There was no accusation in his tone, just a simple observation that nevertheless demanded an explanation. Eleanor hesitated. The truth was humiliating, but she was beyond pride at this point. I arrived in Willow Creek today. My arrangements fell through. I found myself without accommodation or means to secure any. Understanding dawned in Nathaniel's expression. You're the woman Bailey sent for. Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks. Word travels fast in small towns. Not much stays secret for long, he said with a slight shrug. Eleanor reached for her satchel, moving to stand. I'll be on my way, Mr. Cooper. The rain has let up and I've imposed enough. Where exactly do you plan to go at this hour, Miss Blackwood? He asked, making no move to stop her, but clearly skeptical of her plan. It's nearly midnight. Willow Creek is 4 miles back, and there's nothing else for 20 miles in any direction. Eleanor faltered. She hadn't realized she'd slept so long. The storm had indeed quieted to a gentle patter, but the darkness outside the barn door was absolute. I don't know, she admitted, the simple truth of those 3 words devastating in their finality. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. My house isn't much, he said finally, but there's a spare room with a bed, and I've got stew on the stove. You look like you could use both. Eleanor stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need. Why would you help me? Because it's raining, you're stranded, and I'm not in the habit of sending people into the night with nowhere to go. He picked up the lantern. It's just shelter and food, Miss Blackwood, nothing more complicated than that. The simplicity of his answer, free from pity or ulterior motive, decided her. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, I accept your hospitality. He nodded once, then turned toward the barn door. Follow me. Watch your step. The yard turns to mud after a storm. Outside, the world was draped in the hushed aftermath of rain. The clouds had broken in places, allowing glimpses of a star-studded sky. The air smelled clean and new, carrying the scent of wet pine and prairie grass. The house stood approximately 50 yards from the barn, a substantial log structure with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Light glowed from several windows, warm and inviting against the night. As they approached, Eleanor could see flower boxes beneath the front windows, filled with what looked like herb plants rather than decorative blooms. Nathaniel led her up the porch steps and held the door open. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must appear and the impropriety of entering a bachelor's home at such an hour. But the alternative was unthinkable, and so she stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, a cooking pot suspended over the glowing embers. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that appeared well read. The furniture was solid and practical, a sturdy table, with 4 chairs, a writing desk near a window, 2 armchairs positioned by the fire. Everything was clean and orderly, with none of the haphazard disarray one might expect in a bachelor's household. "You can warm yourself by the fire," Nathaniel said, indicating one of the armchairs. "I'll find you something dry to wear." "You have women's clothing?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. A shadow crossed his face. "My sister stayed with me for a time. She left some things behind." Before Eleanor could respond, he disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a bundle of fabric. "These should fit well enough for tonight," he said, offering her the clothes, a simple cotton nightgown and a flannel robe. "The spare room is the second door on the right. There's a wash stand with fresh water. Get changed, and I'll have some food ready when you return." Eleanor accepted the garments, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper." The spare room was small but meticulously clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. A window looked out over the moonlit landscape. Eleanor quickly washed the trail dust from her face and hands, then changed into the borrowed nightgown. It was slightly large, but blessedly dry. The flannel robe, faded from many washings, enveloped her in unexpected warmth. She hesitated, uncertain about rejoining her host in such informal attire, but the rumbling of her empty stomach decided the matter. With as much dignity as she could muster, she made her way back to the main room. Nathaniel was at the fireplace, ladling stew into bowls. He had removed his boots and outer shirt, standing now in trousers and a simple Henley that revealed forearms corded with muscle from years of farm work. He glanced up as she entered. "Better?" he asked. Eleanor nodded self-consciously, pulling the robe tighter. "Much." "Thank you." "Sit," he said, indicating the table where he'd already set places for 2. "The stew isn't fancy, but it's filling." Eleanor took a seat, watching as he placed a steaming bowl before her, along with a thick slice of bread and a mug of coffee. The aroma of the food made her mouth water embarrassingly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. A dry biscuit. On the stagecoach that morning, perhaps. Nathaniel took the seat across from her, though he made no move to begin eating. After a moment of confusion, Eleanor realized he was waiting for her to take the first bite. The simple courtesy brought a lump to her throat. After a day of callous treatment, this small gesture of respect felt monumental. The stew was indeed simple: beef, potatoes, carrots and herbs, but to Eleanor's hunger-sharpened senses it was ambrosia. She ate slowly, mindful of appearances even in her famished state, but it took considerable willpower not to wolf down the entire bowl. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional pop from the fireplace and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence which surprised Eleanor. After the tumultuous events of the day, this quiet moment with a stranger felt oddly peaceful. "May I ask what happened in town?" Nathaniel finally said, breaking the silence. "I only heard fragments from Peterson when he stopped by to deliver some grain." Eleanor set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminished despite her hunger. "I'm sure you heard enough." "I'd rather hear it from you." he said simply. She met his gaze. Across the table, searching for signs of morbid curiosity or judgment. She found neither, only patient attention. "I answered Mr. Bailey's advertisement for a bride," Eleanor began, the words difficult to form. "We exchanged letters for 8 months. He seemed kind, thoughtful. He knew I was a seamstress who had lost my position. I was transparent about my circumstances." She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "But when I arrived and he saw me," she gestured to her leg, "my disability, it became clear he had expected someone different. Someone who could work alongside him without limitation. And he rejected you publicly," Nathaniel stated rather than asked, his voice neutral. Yes, the humiliation of the scene in the cafe burned fresh in her memory. In front of half the town, it seemed. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Bailey always did put appearances above substance. The comment suggested a history between the two men, but Eleanor didn't press. Her situation was precarious enough without involving herself in local feuds. "In any case," she continued, "I found myself with nowhere to go and very little money. I walked until the storm caught me, and your barn seemed the safest option." 4 miles in those shoes, Nathaniel observed, glancing at her worn boots drying by the fire. "That couldn't have been easy." Eleanor managed a wan smile. "I've endured worse." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Nathaniel's expression softened with recognition, the understanding of someone who had also weathered life's harsher seasons. "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment. It was the question Eleanor had been avoiding since walking out of that cafe, the question that loomed like a mountain before her, impossible to scale. "I don't know," she admitted, the words painful in their honesty. "I have $12 to my name, not enough for a room, certainly not enough for a ticket back east, and there's nothing to return to anyway." She hadn't meant to reveal quite so much, but exhaustion had lowered her defenses. She straightened, her shoulders, unwilling to appear as destitute as she felt. "I'll find work, I suppose. I'm skilled with a needle. Perhaps someone in town needs a seamstress." "Not in Willow Creek," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind. "The only women's work to be had is at the saloon or taking in laundry for the miners, and after today you'll find few willing to hire you." "Because I was rejected?" Eleanor asked, incredulous. "Because people take Bailey's word as gospel around here," Nathaniel replied. "He's on the town council, has the ear of the mayor. If he says you're not good enough for him, folks will wonder why they should think differently. The unfairness of it stung. I've done nothing wrong except be disabled." "That's enough for some," Nathaniel said with a grimace. "And scandal is the lifeblood of small towns." Eleanor pushed her empty bowl away, the reality of her situation settling over her like a shroud. "Then I'll go elsewhere. Helena, perhaps, or with $12 and no references." Nathaniel's voice remained gentle despite the bluntness of his words. "Miss Blackwood, I don't mean to be unkind, but I've lived out here long enough to know how quickly the West devours the unprepared." "What would you have me do then?" Eleanor asked, a flash of anger finally breaking through her careful composure. "Beg on the streets, sell myself. I survived Philadelphia's sewing houses and boarding rooms. I'll survive this too." Instead of bristling at her tone, Nathaniel seemed to approve of the spark of defiance. "I have no doubt you would," he said. "But there's a third option you haven't considered." Eleanor regarded him warily. "And what might that be?" "I need help. Around the farm," he said simply. "The house, the accounts, the correspondence with buyers. I've been managing alone since my sister left, but it's wearing me thin. I can offer you the spare room, meals, and a small wage until you decide what you want to do next." Eleanor stared at him, searching for the trap in his offer. "You're proposing to hire me? As what exactly?" "As a housekeeper, if you like. Or a farm assistant, or both. I'm not particular about titles, just results. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know enough, he said. I know you walked 4 miles in a storm rather than stay where you weren't wanted. I know you fell asleep in a strange barn rather than compromise your principles. And I know that Jackson Bailey is a fool who values appearances over character. He rose and collected their empty bowls, carrying them to a wash basin near the kitchen area. The offer stands for 2 weeks. You can rest, recover your strength, and consider your options. After that, if you want to leave, I'll drive you to Helena myself and give you enough to secure lodgings while you look for work. Eleanor was speechless. After a day of cruelty and rejection, this unexpected kindness was almost harder to bear. I don't accept charity, Mr. Cooper, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her, his expression serious. It's not charity, it's an exchange. Your work for room, board, and wages. Nothing more, nothing less. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, an owl called, its mournful cry punctuating the night's stillness. Eleanor considered her options, which were in truth virtually non-existent. 2 weeks, she said at last, to determine if the arrangement suits us both. Nathaniel nodded, seemingly satisfied. Agreed. He showed her back to the spare room, providing an extra blanket against the night's chill and a candle for light. Sleep as late as you need, he said. I'll be out checking the fields in the morning, but there's bread and preserves in the pantry. For breakfast. As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him. Mr. Cooper, he paused in the doorway, looking back. Thank you, she said quietly. Not many would have done what you did tonight. A shadow of something, sadness perhaps, or memory, crossed his face. Get some rest, Miss Blackwood. Tomorrow's soon enough to face the world again. With that, he closed the door softly, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the patchwork quilt. 2 weeks, 14 days to decide her future, to determine if this unexpected haven was truly what it appeared to be. As she extinguished the candle and lay down, she found herself thinking not of Jackson Bailey's cruel rejection, but of Nathaniel, Cooper's blue eyes, eyes that had seen her not as a burden to be dismissed or a woman to be exploited, but as a human being worthy of basic dignity. Outside, the last remnants of the storm passed, and the Dakota sky cleared to reveal a tapestry of stars. Eleanor Blackwood, mail-order bride no longer, drifted into the first peaceful sleep she had known in months, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but for the moment at least, safe from the storm. Morning light filtered through the curtains when Eleanor finally opened her eyes. For a moment, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, disoriented. Then the memories of the previous day crashed over her. The rejection, the storm, Nathaniel Cooper's unexpected offer. She sat up slowly, taking in the spare room in daylight. What had seemed merely functional in the darkness now revealed subtle touches of care. A small vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser, a hand-carved wooden brush beside the wash basin, a quilt that, upon closer inspection, showed extraordinary craftsmanship. Someone had taken great pains with this room despite its simplicity. Eleanor rose and went to the window. The view stole her breath. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, their peaks still wrapped in morning mist. The land immediately. Surrounding the farmhouse was a patchwork of fields, corral, and a small orchard where apple trees stood bare against the morning sky. A stream wound its way through the property, bordered by cottonwoods that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets and smoke-stained buildings. A movement caught her eye. Nathaniel was crossing between fields, carrying what appeared to be repair tools. Even from a distance, she could see the determined way he moved, compensating for his prosthetic leg with practiced efficiency. He stopped to speak with another man, a farmhand presumably, pointing toward a far section of the property before continuing on his way. Eleanor stepped back from the window, suddenly conscious of her borrowed nightclothes and disheveled appearance. She washed quickly at the basin, then surveyed her own clothing with dismay. Her grey dress, hung to dry overnight, was clean enough but hopelessly wrinkled and still bore travel stains from her journey. The thought of appearing before Nathaniel looking so bedraggled filled her with unexpected embarrassment. A knock at the door interrupted her fretting. "Miss Blackwood," Nathaniel's voice came through the wood. "I've left some things outside your door that might be useful. Take your time coming out." Eleanor waited until his footsteps receded, then cracked the door open. On the floor sat a bundle tied with twine. She brought it inside and untied it with curious fingers. Inside, she found a dress of faded blue cotton, simple but well made, along with clean undergarments, thick woolen stockings, and a pair of sturdy boots that looked nearly new. Beneath these lay a comb, a small pot of what appeared to be hand cream, and a bar of lavender soap. Eleanor touched each item with wonder. The clothing was plain but practical, working clothes rather than finery. Yet the thoughtfulness of including such necessities moved her deeply. She dressed quickly, finding that while the clothes were slightly large, they were not uncomfortably so. The boots fit surprisingly well. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized herself. The woman who stared back looked capable, practical, ready to face whatever the day might bring. When she finally emerged, she found the main room empty, but a coffee pot warming on the stove and a cloth-covered plate on the table with a note beside it. The note, written in a surprisingly elegant hand, read, "Gone to mend the north fence. Help yourself to breakfast. Make yourself at home. 2 weeks." That was their agreement, 14 days to determine if this arrangement would work. But what exactly was this arrangement? Housekeeper, farm assistant, some combination of both? And what would happen when the 2 weeks ended? Eleanor pushed these questions aside for now. Better to focus on the immediate, proving her worth, earning her keep, and considering her options one day at a time. After breakfast, Eleanor surveyed the house with a housekeeper's critical eye. It was clean, but clearly maintained by someone who focused on function over comfort. The shelves needed dusting, the floor a thorough sweeping. The kitchen area was organized but showed evidence of bachelor living, mismatched plates, utensils, tossed in a drawer rather than properly sorted. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She found cleaning supplies in a pantry off the kitchen: lye soap, beeswax, vinegar, rags and brushes. Starting with the main room, she cleaned methodically, taking care not to disturb the placement of Nathaniel's possessions while removing months of accumulated dust. As she worked, she took note of the books on his shelves, volumes on agriculture and animal husbandry, but also history, philosophy, and what appeared to be medical texts. Not the library of an uneducated farmer, certainly. By mid-morning, she had swept and dusted the main room and kitchen area and was scrubbing the plank floor when a sound at the door made her look up. A woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged and sturdy, with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that took in Eleanor's appearance in one sweeping glance. "So it's true," the woman said without preamble. "Nathaniel's taken in Bailey's cast-off." Eleanor rose slowly from her knees, cloth still in hand. "I beg your pardon." The woman stepped inside uninvited, closing the door behind her. "News travels fast around these parts. Everyone's talking about how you showed up on Jackson Bailey's doorstep with nothing but a satchel, got yourself rejected, and somehow ended up at the Cooper farm before sundown." She crossed her arms. That didn't take long. Heat flooded Eleanor's face, partly from embarrassment, partly from anger at the insinuation. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Mrs. Sarah Winters." I do the washing for most of the farms here, including this one. Her expression softened slightly. Known Nathaniel Cooper since he came back from the war, which is why I'm here to warn you. Mrs. Winters, Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm despite her racing pulse. Whatever you've heard is undoubtedly distorted. Mr. Cooper offered me temporary employment as his housekeeper after I was caught in yesterday's storm. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Is that what he told you? It's what we agreed upon, Eleanor replied, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. For 2 weeks, after which I'll likely continue to Helena. Sarah looked pointedly at the clothes Eleanor wore. Those are Catherine's things. Catherine? His sister. Left 6 months ago to marry a banker in St. Louis. She stopped herself. Not my place to say. Point is, Nathaniel doesn't let just anyone wear her clothes. Eleanor set down her cleaning rag, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mr. Cooper kindly lent me these until my own can be properly laundered. I'd hardly call that inappropriate. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You're not what I expected. And what did you expect, Mrs. Winters? Someone looking to take advantage, she gestured vaguely. Pretty girl, desperate circumstances, wealthy bachelor. Wouldn't be the first time that story played out badly. Despite herself, Eleanor felt a grudging respect for the woman's bluntness. I assure you, I have no designs on Mr. Cooper or his property. As soon as I've earned enough for passage to Helena, I'll be on my way. Sarah's expression changed subtly, something like approval flickering in her eyes. Well then, since you're here and cleaning anyway, I've brought Nathaniel's washing. She indicated a basket by the door that Eleanor hadn't noticed. Where shall I put it? The swift change in tone was disorienting, but Eleanor recovered quickly. I'll take care of it. Thank you for bringing it along. Sarah nodded and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Nathaniel prefers his shirts hung to dry, not folded wet. Says they wrinkle less that way. With that peculiar piece of advice, she departed, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts once more. She returned to her cleaning with renewed vigor, as if scrubbing the floors could somehow erase the town's gossip. By the time Nathaniel returned, the main living areas were spotless. His washing was hanging on the line outside, and Eleanor had started preparing a stew for the evening meal, using ingredients she'd found in the root cellar. You've been busy, he observed as he removed his hat and coat and hung them by the door. His eyes took in the gleaming floors, the organized shelves, the simmering pot on the stove. I hope you don't mind, Eleanor replied. I wanted to make myself useful. Mind? I haven't seen these floors shine since Catherine left. He ran a hand through his hair, a hint of embarrassment in the gesture. I should warn you, though. You've set a dangerous precedent. I might get used to coming home to clean floors and cooking stew. The casual way he said home struck Eleanor. This place was his home, not just his house. There was a difference, one she had recognized the moment she stepped inside. For all its simple furnishings, the Cooper farm felt lived and cared for. You had a visitor, she said, changing the subject. Nathaniel's expression immediately sobered. Mrs. Winters. You were expecting her. It's Friday. She always brings the washing on Fridays. He studied Eleanor's face. She gave you this speech about Catherine's clothes, I take it, and implied I was setting up to entrap you into marriage. Eleanor confirmed, a wry smile tugging at her lips despite the awkwardness of the conversation. Nathaniel looked mortified. I apologize for her. It's all right, Eleanor assured him. I understand her concern. Do you? His gaze was direct, searching. A bachelor with a prosperous farm, taking in a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. I'd be suspicious too. Eleanor returned to stirring the stew, avoiding his eyes. I assured her our arrangement is temporary and strictly professional. I see. Was there a hint of disappointment in his voice, or was she imagining it? Well, I appreciate you handling her tactfully. Sarah means well, but she can be overwhelming. She was actually quite helpful, Eleanor replied. She told me you prefer your shirts hung rather than folded when wet. Nathaniel laughed, the sound warming the room. She would focus on that. Sarah believes a man can be judged by the state of his shirts. The tension broken, they fell into companionable conversation as Eleanor finished preparing the meal and Nathaniel set the table. He told her about the farm, 160 acres, mostly planted with wheat and corn, with a small apple orchard, and enough livestock for self-sufficiency. It's not the biggest operation in the county, he said, but it's productive. My father started it after the war, the first one, and I expanded it after I returned from the second. You fought in Europe? Eleanor asked, noting how he unconsciously rubbed his leg where flesh met wood. Pacific Theater, Okinawa. His expression closed slightly. Japanese sniper found me while I was dragging a wounded man back to our lines. Woke up on a hospital ship with half a leg and a ticket home. He said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, but Eleanor could see the shadow that crossed his face. Not physical pain, but something deeper. I'm sorry, she said simply. Don't be. I was one of the lucky ones. He poured them both water from a pitcher. Many didn't come back at all. Eleanor nodded, understanding. She had seen enough returned soldiers in Philadelphia, empty-eyed men selling pencils on street corners, former pilots whose hands shook too badly to hold a cup. What about you? Nathaniel asked, changing the subject. How did a Philadelphia seamstress end up answering a matrimonial advertisement in Dakota Territory? Eleanor hesitated. It was a fair question, given that he had shared his own story, but the answer required a vulnerability she rarely displayed. A riding accident, she said finally. I was 10. The horse spooked and fell, crushing my leg beneath it. The doctors said I was fortunate they didn't have to amputate. She smoothed her skirt over the steel brace, a gesture so habitual she barely noticed doing it anymore. I managed well enough. My parents were supportive, made sure I received an education when many thought it a waste for a crippled girl. I learned. Sewing from my mother, found work at a dress shop in Philadelphia. What changed? Nathaniel asked quietly. My father died, Eleanor replied, unable to keep the grief entirely from her voice. Pneumonia took him last winter. After the funeral expenses, there was nothing left. Then the new owner at Whitmore's decided that customers didn't want to see. A seamstress who used a crutch, regardless of the quality of her stitches. Nathaniel's expression darkened. That's absurd. That's Philadelphia, Eleanor said with a shrug that belied the pain of the memory. After losing my position, I tried to find other work, but the doors kept closing. Dressmaking, shopkeeping, even laundry work, all suddenly required physical robustness I supposedly lacked. She took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. Then I saw Mr. Bailey's advertisement. He seemed kind in his letters, understanding. He wrote about building a life together, about wanting a companion who valued education and domestic skills. I thought perhaps in a place where people were judged by their contribution rather than their appearance. She trailed off, embarrassed by the naive hope that had led her across the country. You thought the West might be different, Nathaniel finished for her. Foolish, I know. Not foolish, he countered, just optimistic, and not entirely wrong. The West can be unforgiving, but it also offers second chances to those willing to work for them. His words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that extended beyond her immediate situation. After dinner, Nathaniel insisted on helping with the dishes despite Eleanor's protests. I'm not an invalid, he said with a self-deprecating smile, despite evidence to the contrary. Eleanor found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. Well, if you insist on helping, I insist you dry. I've organized the cupboards and I won't have you undoing my system. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the gentle domesticity of the task a balm after the chaos of the previous day. When the kitchen was clean, Nathaniel invited her to join him by the fire. "I usually read in the evenings," he explained, "but I'd welcome company if you're not too tired." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before settling into one of the armchairs. Nathaniel selected a book from the shelf, a collection of Walt Whitman's poems, and asked if she had a preference. "Song of the Open Road," she said without hesitation. "It's always been a favorite." Nathaniel's eyes lit with approval. "A woman who appreciates Whitman. I shouldn't be surprised." He began to read aloud, his deep voice giving new resonance. "To familiar words. Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose." As the evening deepened around them, Eleanor found herself relaxing truly for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. The fire crackled cheerfully, the wind whispered around the eaves of the house, and Nathaniel's voice rose and fell with the rhythm of Whitman's poetry. 3 days passed with surprising swiftness. Eleanor fell into a rhythm at the Cooper farm, rising early to prepare breakfast, before Nathaniel headed out to work the fields. Mornings were devoted to household tasks, cleaning, mending, baking bread that filled the cabin with a homey aroma that seemed to please Nathaniel more than he would admit. Afternoons found her in the small vegetable garden behind the house, preparing it for winter and planning what might be planted when spring arrived. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor knelt in the rich soil, pulling the last of the stubborn weeds that had flourished in neglect. The sun warmed her shoulders through the faded blue work dress, and the breeze carried the scent of pine from the nearby woods. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and rolled her sleeves to the elbow, practicality winning over propriety. "You have a way with growing things," Nathaniel observed, approaching from the direction of the barn. He had been repairing a wagon all morning, and sawdust clung to his clothes and hair. Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Plants ask for little, just consistent care and attention. She gestured to the newly turned soil, now ready for winter's dormancy. "It's satisfying work. You can see the results of your efforts." "Unlike wheat," Nathaniel said with a wry smile, "contrary crop that seems determined to undo a day's work in 5 minutes flat." Eleanor laughed, the sound coming more easily now than it had days ago. "The wagon giving. You trouble? Nothing I can't handle." He offered her his hand, helping her to her feet. "But I could use some of that apple cider you made yesterday if there's any left." "There is." She brushed the soil from her skirt. "I'll bring it to the porch." They had fallen into this comfortable pattern. Brief conversations throughout the day, shared meals, evenings spent reading or discussing the day's events. It was easy, this arrangement between them, perhaps too easy for something meant to be temporary. She was retrieving the cider from the root cellar when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the window, she saw a group of riders coming up the main road, 5 men led by a figure she recognized with a jolt of dismay. Jackson Bailey. Nathaniel had seen them too. He stood in the yard, his posture alert but not yet hostile. As the riders approached, Eleanor set down the pitcher and moved to the door, anxiety pooling in her stomach. "Cooper!" Jackson called, reining in his horse a few yards from where Nathaniel stood. "Thought I'd pay a neighborly visit." "Bailey." Nathaniel's voice revealed nothing. "Don't recall the last time you rode out this way." Jackson dismounted, his movements deliberate. He was dressed more formally than the situation warranted. Polished boots, a fine waistcoat beneath his riding coat, a watch chain gleaming in the sunlight, calculated to emphasize the contrast between his prosperity and Nathaniel's more modest circumstances. "Been busy?" Jackson replied, his gaze sliding to Eleanor in the doorway. "Miss Blackwood, I see you found accommodation." Eleanor stepped onto the porch, determined not to cower. "Mr. Bailey, what brings you and your friends so far from town?" The men with Jackson remained mounted, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Eleanor recognized one as Harris, the man from the cafe who had witnessed her humiliation. Another wore a sheriff's badge, though his youth suggested limited experience. "Heard you were staying out at the Cooper place," Jackson said, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold. "Got concerned about your welfare." "My welfare," Eleanor echoed incredulously. "A single woman, alone at a remote farm with a bachelor of," he paused meaningfully, "questionable reputation." Folks in town were worried. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Miss Blackwood is employed here as my housekeeper." "Nothing improper about that," Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" One of his companions snickered. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger at the insinuation. "I believe Mr. Cooper has made the situation clear, Mr. Bailey. I'm earning my keep until I have sufficient funds to move on." "Very convenient arrangement," Jackson observed, "especially for a woman who arrived in town with nothing but the clothes on her back." He turned to Nathaniel. "Didn't figure you for a charity case, Cooper, and I didn't figure you for a coward, Bailey," Nathaniel replied evenly. "Yet here you are, bringing 4 men to back you in a conversation that could have been handled alone." Jackson's smile tightened. "Just being cautious. Your temper's well known in these parts, only to those who provoke it." Nathaniel crossed his arms. "State your business plainly. My time's valuable, even if yours isn't." The young sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Bailey reported concerns about the lady's situation, Mr. Cooper. As an officer of the law?" "As Bailey's errand boy," Nathaniel interrupted. "You've got no authority here, Jenkins, unless you've got a warrant or evidence of wrongdoing." The young man flushed. "Well, no, but—" "Then this is trespassing," Nathaniel stated flatly. "And harassment." Jackson stepped forward, his cordial facade slipping. "You think you're untouchable out here, don't you, Cooper? The town council might be interested to know you're harboring a woman of questionable virtue." Before Nathaniel could respond, Eleanor descended the porch steps, rage propelling her forward. "Questionable virtue? Because I had the misfortune of putting my faith in a man who values appearances over character? Or because I accepted honest work instead of begging on the streets after you discarded me like unwanted baggage?" Jackson blinked, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. "Now, Miss Blackwood," she cut him off, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You rejected me publicly, Mr. Bailey. Made me a spectacle, left me with nowhere to go. Mr. Cooper offered me employment when you offered only humiliation. And now you dare to question my virtue?" The men on horseback exchanged glances, seemingly uncomfortable with this turn in the conversation. Even Harris had the grace to look away. Jackson's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Miss Blackwood. Cooper isn't what he seems." "Neither were you," she retorted. "At least he's been honest from the start." "Honest?" Jackson barked a laugh. "Did he tell you why his sister left? Why half the town won't do business with him? Did he tell you about the Wilson property dispute?" Nathaniel moved with unexpected swiftness, grabbing Jackson by the front of his expensive coat. "That's enough, Bailey." The other men immediately tensed, hands moving to their weapons. The young sheriff dismounted, his inexperience evident in his nervous demeanor. "Mr. Cooper, I'm going to have to ask you to release Mr. Bailey," he said, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered pistol. For a moment, the tableau held. Nathaniel's knuckles white against Jackson's coat, the mounted men waiting for a signal, Eleanor frozen in place. Then Nathaniel released Jackson with a slight shove, stepping back. "Get off my property," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you." Jackson straightened his coat, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Showing your true colors, Cooper. Just like always." He turned to Eleanor. When you tire of playing housekeeper to a man with blood on his hands, Willow Creek isn't without charity. The church ladies might take pity on you." "I don't need pity," Eleanor said coldly. "Yours or theirs." Jackson shrugged and remounted his horse. "Your choice, Miss Blackwood. But don't say you weren't warned." He looked down at Nathaniel. "Town council meets Tuesday. Might be discussing road access to that stream that feeds your east fields. Shame if the vote went against you." With that parting threat, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his companions following. The young sheriff lingered a moment longer, looking uncomfortable. "No offense meant, Mr. Cooper," he said quietly. "Just doing my job." "Your job is upholding the law, Jenkins," Nathaniel replied, "not being Bailey's puppet. Your father would be disappointed." The young man's face fell at that, and he mounted hastily, spurring his horse to catch up with the others. Silence descended as the dust from the rider's departure settled. Eleanor became aware of her trembling hands and clenched them to stop their movement. Nathaniel stood rigid, staring after the retreating figures, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Nathaniel," she said gently, using his given name, deliberately to break through his anger. "What was that about?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was shuttered in a way it hadn't been since her arrival. "You should probably start packing." The word struck like a physical blow. "What?" "Bailey won't stop." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. "He'll make good on his threats, to me and to your reputation. Better if you leave now. Get ahead of whatever story he's spinning in town." Eleanor stared at him, disbelieving. "You're sending me away." "I'm trying to protect you," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Bailey has influence. He can make life impossible for both of us if he chooses." "So we let him win?" Eleanor challenged. "I run away, proving whatever vile rumors he's spreading, and you, what? Lose your water access because you dared to help me?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "It's more complicated than that." "Then explain it to me," she insisted. "What did he mean about your sister, about the Wilson property?" For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Let's go inside. This isn't a conversation to have standing." In the yard, in the house, Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept on a high shelf. He offered one to Eleanor, who accepted it without comment, despite never having touched spirits before. They sat at the table, the afternoon, light casting long shadows across the plank floor. "Catherine left 6 months ago," Nathaniel began after a long silence. "She came to live with me after our parents died in a fire. She was 20, unmarried. I was the only family she had left." He took a small sip of his whiskey. "She is willful, headstrong, much like our mother had been." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to the story. Jackson Bailey was 30 then, already established in town. He started calling on Catherine, brought her gifts, took her driving on Sundays. His knuckles whitened around his glass. "I didn't trust him. His interests seemed calculated. Our father had left her a small inheritance to be managed by me until she turned 25. And Bailey knew this," Eleanor said, beginning to understand. Nathaniel nodded. "I told Catherine my concerns. She accused me of trying to control her life, of being jealous of Bailey's success." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Then one night, she didn't come home. I found her at Bailey's ranch, distraught. She wouldn't tell me what happened, but she never spoke to him again." "He hurt her," Eleanor said softly. "It wasn't a question. In some way, yes, but she wouldn't say how, and I couldn't." "Prove anything." Nathaniel's eyes darkened with old rage. "A week later, she announced she was going to St. Louis to stay with our aunt. I tried to convince her to stay, but she needed to get away," Eleanor finished for him, "from the memories, from the town's gossip." "Yes." He took another sip of whiskey, Bailey spread rumors that I had driven her away out of jealousy, that I was controlling her inheritance for my own gain. It divided the town, those who believed him and those who knew me better. Eleanor thought of Sarah Winters's protective visit, of the way some townsfolk seemed wary of Nathaniel, while others apparently respected him. And the Wilson property? What was that about? Nathaniel's expression grew more troubled. Robert Wilson owned the property bordering mine to the east. Good water access, excellent grazing land. He was an old man, lived alone. We were friends of a sort. He had no family. He rose and moved to the window, staring out at the land as if seeing the past play out before him. Wilson died suddenly. Heart failure, the doctor said. In his will, he left his property to me. Nathaniel turned back to face her. Bailey had been courting him as well, bringing him into town for council meetings, offering to buy his land. He turned back to face her. When the will was read, Bailey accused me of coercion, even suggesting I might have had something to do with Wilson's death. That's absurd, Eleanor gasped. Surely no one believed that. Some did. Enough to create doubt. Nathaniel returned to the table but didn't sit. The will stood. It was properly executed, witnessed by the town judge. But Bailey has been working against me ever since, blocking grain sales, interfering with water rights, turning opinion against me wherever he can. And now he sees me as another weapon to use against you, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. Precisely. Nathaniel returned to the table but didn't. Sit. So you see why it might be better if you left, not just for your sake, but for mine as well. Eleanor considered his words carefully. She had come to Dakota Territory seeking security, a place to belong. Instead, she had walked into a years-long feud and now found herself being used as a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. The practical choice would be to leave, to take what little money she had earned and make her way to Helena as planned. Start fresh, where neither Jackson's rejection nor Nathaniel's complicated past could touch her. But something in her rebelled at the thought. Running away had never been her nature, even when staying meant hardship. What if I don't want to leave? She asked quietly. Nathaniel looked startled. Did you not hear what I just told you? Bailey will do whatever he plans to do regardless, she interrupted. My leaving won't stop his vendetta against you. It will only prove he has the power to disrupt your life whenever he chooses. And what about your reputation? The gossip? Eleanor gave a small, bitter laugh. My reputation was compromised the moment I stepped off that stagecoach. Mr. Cooper, I was judged and found wanting before I spoke a single word to Jackson Bailey. She met his gaze steadily. I didn't let his rejection define me then. I won't let his threats define me now. Nathaniel studied her face, something like admiration flickering in his blue eyes. You're not what I expected, Eleanor Blackwood. No, she agreed with a slight smile. I imagine not. He returned to his seat, considering. If you stay, it won't be easy. Bailey has a long reach in this county. Few worthwhile things in life are easy, she replied. But I won't stay where I'm not wanted. If you truly believe my presence endangers your farm or your standing, it's not that, Nathaniel said quickly. Your presence has been, he searched for the right word, valuable. The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than it should have. Then I'll stay at least until our 2 weeks are concluded, as agreed. She straightened her shoulders. And I'll face whatever Jackson Bailey chooses to throw at us. Nathaniel nodded slowly. All right, but we'll need to be careful. Bailey doesn't make idle threats. Neither do I, Eleanor said with quiet determination. And I've survived worse than a small-town bully with an inflated sense of importance. A rare smile curved Nathaniel's lips. I believe you have. He raised his glass slightly. To standing firm. Eleanor lifted her own glass, the amber liquid catching the late afternoon light. To standing firm. They drank, the whiskey burning, a path down Eleanor's throat and settling warmly in her stomach. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western hills, bathing the land in golden light. The day's confrontation had changed something between them, a shared adversary creating an unexpected alliance. Eleanor knew staying was risky. Jackson's veiled accusations in the sheriff's presence had made that clear, but running had never solved her problems before, and she doubted it would now. Better to face whatever came next with dignity and resolve. And if part of her decision to stay stemmed from a growing attachment to this place and the man across from her, well, that was a complication she would examine another day. The next morning dawned clear and cool with no sign of the previous day's tensions. Eleanor rose early, determined to maintain their established routine despite Jackson's ominous visit. She was kneading dough for breakfast biscuits when a sharp knock at the door startled her. Nathaniel emerged from his room, still buttoning his shirt. "Stay back," he warned, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted near the door. "Nathaniel," she protested, but he had already opened the door, rifle held casually but ready. Instead of Jackson or his men, however, a young boy of perhaps 12 stood on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Got a telegram for Mr. Cooper," the boy announced, holding out a yellow envelope. "Mr. Peterson at the office said it was urgent." Nathaniel lowered the rifle and took the telegram, fishing in his pocket for a coin, which he tossed to the boy. "Thanks, Billy. Tell your pa I said hello." The boy nodded, pocketed the coin, and raced back to his waiting pony. Eleanor watched as Nathaniel opened the envelope, his expression growing more troubled as he read its contents. "Bad news?" she asked when he finally looked up from the paper. "From my sister," he replied, his voice tense. "She's coming home, arriving on tomorrow's stage." Eleanor wasn't sure why this would be cause for concern. "Isn't that good news?" Under normal circumstances, yes, but her timing couldn't be worse. He handed her the telegram. Eleanor read the brief message. "Arriving tomorrow's afternoon stage. Stop. Urgent matters to discuss. Stop. Sorry for short notice. Stop. All will be explained." "Stop, Catherine. I don't understand," Eleanor said, returning the telegram. "Why is this a problem?" "Because Catherine hasn't been back to Willow Creek since the incident with Bailey, because she knows nothing about you, and because urgent matters from my sister has never meant anything good." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "You think this has something to do with Bailey?" "I think it's too much of a coincidence that she's returning now, immediately after Bailey made his threats." Nathaniel folded the telegram and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Whatever the reason, we need to prepare. Catherine can be difficult." "I should leave before she arrives," Eleanor said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "It would be easier for you both. What happened to standing firm?" Nathaniel looked at her sharply. "That was before your sister's impending arrival," she pointed out. "I won't come between family, Nathaniel." "You're not." Catherine left of her own accord, and whatever her urgent matters are, they won't change the fact that you have a place here for as long as you need it. The conviction in his voice touched her deeply. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Eleanor, I meant what I said yesterday. Your presence here has been valuable, more than I expected." There was something in his eyes, something beyond the simple appreciation of an employer over a competent housekeeper, something that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks warm. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Then Nathaniel stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should ride into town, see if I can learn anything more about Catherine's return. Maybe talk to Judge Morrison about Bailey's threats." Eleanor nodded, both disappointed and relieved by the return. "To practicalities. I'll have dinner ready when you return, and I'll prepare the spare room for your sister." "You're sleeping in the spare room," Nathaniel pointed out. "I can make up a bed in the storage room." she replied. It's small, but it will suffice for a few nights. Nathaniel frowned. That won't be necessary. Catherine can take my room. I'll sleep in the barn until we sort things out. But it's decided, he said firmly. I won't have you sleeping in a storage closet when there's a perfectly good bed available. Eleanor recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and conceded with a nod. Very well, but I'll still prepare your room for her arrival. Thank you. He reached for his hat and coat. I won't be long. At the door, he paused. And Eleanor, don't worry about Catherine or Bailey. We'll weather this storm together. With that promise hanging in the air, he departed, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the dough still waiting to be shaped into biscuits. She returned to her task, her mind spinning with possibilities and concerns. Whatever storm was gathering on the horizon, she had made her choice to stand firm beside Nathaniel Cooper. Now she would have to face the consequences, be they Catherine's arrival, Jackson's malice, or the growing feelings she could no longer ignore. Eleanor rose before dawn on the day of Catherine's arrival, unable to sleep with anxiety twisting in her stomach. She moved quietly through the dimly lit house, careful not to wake Nathaniel, who had returned late from town the previous evening with a troubled expression and little information. She lit the stove and began preparations for a substantial breakfast, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of cooking. By the time sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, she had fresh bread cooling on the counter, eggs and bacon ready to cook, and coffee brewing. Nathaniel emerged from his room, his hair still damp from washing. He paused in the doorway, watching her work. You didn't need to go to all this trouble, he said. Eleanor glanced up, offering a small smile. It helps me think, and we should both eat well before... She trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. Nathaniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Did you sleep at all? A little. She turned her attention back to the eggs sizzling in the pan. Did you learn anything useful in town? Not about Catherine, but Bailey's been busy, called a special meeting of the town council for this afternoon. Topic listed as moral concerns within the community. Eleanor's hand faltered slightly as she served the eggs. He's not wasting any time. No, Nathaniel agreed grimly. He never does. They ate in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor used the time to study Nathaniel's face, the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. In just over a week, this man had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thought of causing him additional difficulty with the town or his sister weighed heavily on her conscience. I could still go, she said quietly, setting down her fork. Take the morning stage to Helena. Be gone before Catherine arrives. Nathaniel's gaze snapped to hers. Is that what you want? No, she admitted. But it might be the simplest solution. Simple isn't always right. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. Eleanor, I won't force you to stay in a difficult situation. If you want to leave, I'll understand, but don't do it just to spare me complications with Catherine or Bailey. The conviction in his voice steadied her. All right. I'll stay, at least until we see what Catherine's visit entails. Relief flashed across his features. Good. The clock on the town hall struck 3 as the stagecoach rolled into Willow Creek, its wheels stirring dust that danced in the afternoon. Light. Eleanor stood beside Nathaniel on the wooden platform, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. All around them, townspeople went about their business, though many slowed to cast curious glances their way. You didn't need to come, Nathaniel said quietly. It might have been easier if you'd stayed at the farm. I won't hide, Eleanor replied, lifting her chin slightly. I've done nothing wrong. His expression softened. No, you haven't. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, and the driver secured the team, while the attendant opened the door for the passengers. A middle-aged couple disembarked first, followed by a traveling salesman. Then a slender figure appeared in the doorway, pausing to survey the gathered crowd. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same blue eyes and proud bearing as Nathaniel, though on a decidedly feminine face, framed by honey blonde hair styled fashionably beneath a smart hat. She wore a traveling suit of deep green, the quality of the fabric speaking of city prosperity. Catherine Cooper had returned to Willow Creek, and she looked nothing like the heartbroken girl who had fled 6 months earlier. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice clear and confident. Nathaniel moved forward, Eleanor a half-step behind. "Catherine." Brother and sister stood facing each other for a moment, the tension almost palpable. Then Catherine smiled, a small, tentative thing, and Nathaniel pulled her into a brief, awkward embrace. "You look well," he said as they separated. "So do you," she replied, her gaze shifting to Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "And who might this be?" Nathaniel straightened. "Catherine, this is Miss Eleanor Blackwood. She's been staying at the farm this past week. Eleanor, my sister Catherine Cooper." Eleanor extended her hand, determined to make a good impression despite her nerves. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Cooper. Your brother has spoken highly of you." Catherine's handshake was firm, her assessment frank and unabashed. "Has he? How interesting. Nathaniel rarely speaks highly of anyone." She turned back to her brother. "My trunk should be on top. I assume you brought the wagon." "Of course," Nathaniel replied, moving to help the driver unload her luggage. Left alone with Catherine, Eleanor maintained her composure despite the younger woman's continued scrutiny. "I've prepared your room for you," she offered. "I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." "My room," Catherine repeated, something unreadable in her tone. "And where are you sleeping, Miss Blackwood?" The question's implication was clear. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Your brother has been kind enough to offer me the spare room while I'm employed as his housekeeper." "Housekeeper?" Catherine echoed, arching one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "How convenient for both of you." Before Eleanor could respond, Nathaniel returned, with Catherine's trunk secured on his shoulder. "Everything's loaded. We should get back to the farm before dark." As they turned to leave, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Jackson Bailey stood in the doorway of the general store, watching them intently. When their eyes met, he tipped his hat mockingly before disappearing inside. The ride home was strained, with Catherine seated between them on the wagon bench. She made polite inquiries about the farm and the town, but avoided any mention of why she had returned so suddenly or what urgent matters she needed to discuss. Inside the house, Catherine paused to take in the changes Eleanor had made. The fresh curtains, the polished surfaces, the vase of dried wildflowers on the table. "It looks different," she said quietly. "Eleanor has a gift for making a house feel like home," Nathaniel replied, carrying her trunk to his bedroom. Catherine turned to Eleanor with new interest. "So it seems. Perhaps we could talk privately while my brother attends to the evening chores." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she nodded. "Of course." Once Nathaniel had gone out to the barn, Catherine settled at the kitchen table where Eleanor was preparing tea. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries, Miss Blackwood," she said directly. "I know who you are. Jackson Bailey's rejected bride, now conveniently employed by my brother." Eleanor set the teapot down with deliberate calm. "There's nothing convenient about it, Miss Cooper. I found myself in desperate circumstances, and your brother offered me honest work." "And nothing more?" Eleanor met her gaze directly. "Your brother has been a perfect gentleman." Catherine studied her for a long moment, then unexpectedly smiled. "I believe you. Which makes you very different from most women who've set their cap for Nathaniel." "I haven't set my cap for anyone," Eleanor protested. "Perhaps not intentionally." Catherine accepted the cup of tea Eleanor offered. But I've seen how he looks at you, and I suspect, if you're honest with yourself, you've developed feelings for him as well." Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "Miss Cooper, Catherine, please." "Catherine, I came to Dakota Territory seeking security, not romance. I've learned my lesson about depending on a man's good graces." "A wise perspective," Catherine agreed, "but sometimes the heart doesn't follow wisdom, does it?" Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Nathaniel returned. He looked between them, sensing the charged atmosphere. "Should I be worried?" he asked lightly. "Not at all," Catherine replied. "Miss Blackwood and I were just getting acquainted." She turned to her brother, her expression sobering. "But now we need to discuss why I've come back." Nathaniel pulled out a chair. "I'm listening." Catherine reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. "I received this letter 3 days ago from Judge Morrison." She slid it across the table. "Bailey is petitioning the county to invalidate Robert Wilson's will on grounds of undue influence. He's found 3 witnesses who claim to have heard Wilson complain that you pressured him." "That's a lie," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with anger. "Of course it is," Catherine agreed. "But Bailey's witnesses include the mayor's brother-in-law and Sheriff Jenkins's father, men whose word carries weight." Eleanor watched the color drain from Nathaniel's face. "If they invalidate the will, you lose the water rights to your East Fields," Catherine finished. "And Bailey gains control of the most valuable farmland in the county." A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor thought of the threat Bailey had made, the town council meeting, the road access to the stream. It had all been part of a larger plan. "There's more," Catherine continued. "Bailey has been spreading stories in town about Miss Blackwood, about her character." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "What kind of stories?" Catherine's expression was apologetic. "The kind meant to destroy a woman's reputation. He's claiming you were dismissed from your position in Philadelphia for improper behavior, that several men there can attest to your availability for a price." "That's absurd." Nathaniel slammed his fist on the table. "Eleanor is the most honorable woman I've ever met." "I know that," Catherine said calmly. "But the people of Willow Creek don't, and Bailey is very convincing." Eleanor sat very still, absorbing this new blow. To have her disability mocked was painful, but to have her virtue slandered was devastating. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would he go to such lengths? I'm nothing to him." "Because you're something to Nathaniel," Catherine said simply, "and Bailey wants to destroy anything that matters to my brother." Nathaniel stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "I won't let him get away with this. Not the lies about Wilson, and certainly not the slander against Eleanor." "There's a way to fight back," Catherine said, a determined glint in her eye. "That's the other reason I came home." She reached into her bag again and produced another document. "I've been working as a legal assistant in St. Louis. When I heard about Bailey's petition, I started making inquiries." She spread the paper on the table. "Bailey's so-called witnesses, they all owe him money, gambling debts, loans for failed businesses, and the mayor's brother-in-law was seen accepting a rather large payment from Bailey 2 days before he suddenly remembered." Hearing Wilson complain, hope flickered in Nathaniel's eyes. "You have proof?" "Statements from 3 reputable businessmen who witnessed the payment," Catherine confirmed. "And something else." She lowered her voice. "Bailey's been forging land deeds, small parcels belonging to miners who've moved on. The county recorder suspected something was wrong with the signatures and kept the originals." Eleanor looked between the siblings. "This could ruin him." "It should," Catherine agreed. "Judge Morrison is prepared to hear evidence next week." She turned to her brother. "But there's one more problem. Bailey's accusations against Miss Blackwood." "What about them?" Nathaniel asked. "The judge suggested that her situation here might undermine your credibility. A bachelor living with An unmarried woman, even as employer and employee, it raises questions. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Then I should go. I won't be the reason Nathaniel loses everything he's worked for. No! Nathaniel's voice was firm. There's another solution. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Nathaniel, are you suggesting— Miss Blackwood, he said formally, turning to Eleanor, would you join me on the porch? I believe we have a matter to discuss privately. Outside, the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor stood at the railing, her heart racing as Nathaniel paced before her. Eleanor, he finally said, stopping directly in front of her, I know this is sudden. We've known each other barely 2 weeks. But in that time you've shown more courage, more integrity than anyone I've ever met. He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. What Bailey's doing, the lies, the slander, it's unconscionable. But perhaps there's a way to defeat him and secure your future at the same time. Eleanor's breath caught. What are you suggesting? Marriage, he said simply. Not just as a solution to our current troubles, but as the beginning of something I believe could bring us both happiness. Nathaniel, she whispered, stunned. You can't mean I do. His blue eyes were earnest, vulnerable. I know it's not the romance you might have dreamed of. I'm not a wealthy man like Bailey. I have a wooden leg and a farm that requires endless work. But I care for you, Eleanor, deeply, and I believe we could build a good life together. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. Because of Bailey's threats, because of the property. No, he said firmly. Those things only forced me to acknowledge what I've felt since the night you appeared in my barn. You've brought light back into my home, Eleanor. You've faced every challenge with grace and determination. You've seen beyond my disability to the man beneath. He touched her cheek softly. How could I not fall in love with you? The simple declaration stole her breath. Love? Yes, he said, his voice certain. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you hum when you're kneading bread, the way you laugh at my poor jokes, the way you refuse to let your disability define you. A single tear escaped, tracing its way down Eleanor's cheek. I came west seeking security, not love. And have you found it? Security? She thought about the past 2 weeks, the work that gave her purpose, the home she had begun to create, the man who saw her true worth. Yes, she admitted softly. More than I expected. And what of love? Have you found that too? Eleanor looked up at him, this man who had offered her shelter when she had nothing, who had defended her against Bailey's cruelty, who had seen her not as broken, but as whole. I believe I have, she whispered. The smile that illuminated his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He drew her gently into his arms, and when his lips met hers, Eleanor knew she had found not just security, but a home for her heart. 3 days later, they stood before Judge Morrison in his office, exchanging vows witnessed by Catherine and Sarah Winters, whose initial suspicion had transformed into fierce support. Eleanor wore a simple dress of pale blue, sewn by her own hands from fabric Catherine had brought from St. Louis. I, Eleanor Blackwood, take you, Nathaniel Cooper, to be my lawfully wedded husband. She spoke clearly, her voice steady with conviction. To partner with you in all things, to stand firm through adversity, to build a home and a life worthy of the trust between us. The traditional vows had been modified by mutual agreement, reflecting the unique foundation of their union. Not blind romantic love, but clear-eyed respect and growing affection, tested by fire and found resilient. That afternoon, Judge Morrison heard Catherine's evidence against Jackson Bailey. By evening, Bailey had been ordered to cease his petition against Wilson's will, and the county sheriff, the elder Jenkins, not his inexperienced son, had begun an investigation into the forged deeds. As twilight softened the landscape, Eleanor stood on the porch of what was now truly her home, watching the stars emerge one by one. Nathaniel joined her, slipping his arm around her waist. "Having regrets, Mrs. Cooper?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice. Eleanor smiled, still growing, accustomed to her new name. "Not one," she assured him, "though I am thinking about curtains for the front windows and expanding the garden next spring." Nathaniel laughed, the sound warming her heart. "Already making plans, I see." "Many plans," she agreed. "This is just the beginning." He raised his cup in a toast. "To beginnings, and to the woman who arrived with a satchel and claimed an entire world." Eleanor clinked her cup against his. "And to the man who saw beyond appearances to value what truly matters." As darkness settled over the Dakota prairie, Eleanor Blackwood Cooper looked out over the land that was now her home. The rolling fields, the distant hills, the garden she had reclaimed from neglect. Jackson Bailey had rejected her for being too crippled, seeing only her physical limitations. Nathaniel had seen her courage, her determination, her worth beyond her disability. In doing so, he had indeed given her the world, not through wealth or status, but through partnership, respect, and the promise of a future they would build together, one day at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.